In this episode, we'll talk about interview lighting when I have to work really quickly. Let's talk about some thoughts for each of the main lights here. Number one, key light. With the key light, I typically like to use a soft light. In this particular case, I'm using a Gemini 1x1 from Litepanels. That's going through a softbox, which is about 2 feet by 2 feet, so 24 inches by 24 inches. And that is lighting the majority of my face. Now, I'm talking straight into the camera, so it's going to look a little bit more like this. I usually put it off to at least a 45-degree angle, maybe a little bit more, to get a little bit of a dramatic look here and to get some Rembrandt lighting where you get the little triangle of light here on the cheek opposite the light. So that's usually a pretty interesting look. Now, when you have the talent looking slightly off camera for an interview like this, what I typically like to do is light the far side of the face that is farthest away from the camera. That adds a little bit more interest. And then basically at that point, your camera is actually closest to the fill side of the face, the part where you're using the fill light. And so that just gives a more interesting, dramatic, more pleasing look overall. Let's talk about fill lights. Fill lights, I think, in the classic three-point lighting, fill lights are horrible. They actually are really dangerous because what I find a lot of times is when people start using them, they'll put them basically at 45 degrees off to the opposite side of the camera of the key light, and they'll be fighting with how much light in the fill to use, and you'll end up with double shadows, where the shadows kind of crisscross underneath the person's nose or their neck, and it's a bad idea. My preference for fill light, if I'm going to use it, and I don't always use it, is in this case, for example, I put the fill light almost as close to the camera as I can, and then I bounce it off of a bounce board. And then I can just sort of dial it in, and all I'm looking to do there is lift the shadows on the shadow side of the face just a little bit, just so it's not completely lost in shadow. Now with rim lighting or hair lighting or however you approach that, I don't often have times to rig up an entire light, fly it up behind the talent and bring it down directly on top of their head when I'm doing my corporate videos. And so a lot of times I'll do a rim instead. I can put a rim on a stand just like we're doing here, and just put it off to one side, the opposite side of the key light of the person. So in this case, the rim's over here, the key light's over here. And that just brings some light. And I typically like to use a soft light there as well. So something in a soft box or a soft panel or anything that I can do to kind of get the light to wrap a little bit. I try not to get it to wrap all the way to the nose, just around the side of the face and the back of the head a little bit. And that's generally going to work a little bit better for people who are bald as well, because a lot of times what you do, you don't want to use typically a hair light on someone who's bald because it just makes this, really enormous specular highlight, and it kind of screams to the world, this guy is bald. So not usually a look you're going for. I find that a lot of times a rim light's going to work a little bit better in that situation. Now for the background light or lights, there are a lot of things you can do. If you just need something very quick and simple, a splash of light. Often, I would say a hard light up on a wall behind the person can really do some interesting things. This is where a hard light's generally going to be more interesting. And so in this case, I'm using a Gemini 1x1 hard. So it's a 1x1 panel that produces a hard light. And you can see it creates there's a little bit of a vignette. It leaves a pattern on the wall. That's a pretty straightforward, simple way to do that. Now, there's some other things you can do as well. Now, that particular light's an RGB light, and we were able to dial in some purple, add some interest, some interesting color. Now, if you don't have an RGB light, there are still some things you can do in terms of creating interesting color. So, for example, on this shot, what we did is we shot with a key light set to white balance of tungsten, 3200 Kelvin. And then what we did is we set the background lights to 5600 Kelvin. And that's why they appear blue. Now, of course, on the camera, we set the white balance to 3200 Kelvin to match the key light because we want our skin tones to look natural, and so that's what you do. But because the camera is set to 3200 Kelvin, it's reading the 5600 Kelvin lights as blue, and that can be one way to do it. Or you can do the inverse. You can put 55 or 5600 Kelvin on the light, dial your white balance to daylight, and then set the background light to 3200 Kelvin, and then you get a nice warm background light. So You have to think about color as well. What are you trying to convey with the piece? Is it something where you want it to feel kind of warm and it's a feel-good type of thing? Maybe the background light is 3200 Kelvin and the key light is 5600 Kelvin would fit that situation a little bit better. If you want to do something that is a little bit more maybe technical, or you're trying to convey something that is more impressive, something like that, that's where you might want to use something that's a little bit more bluish. And that's where you would set the key light to 3200 Kelvin, set your camera's white balance to 3200 Kelvin, and set the background light to 5600 Kelvin. That way you get that blue in the background. Now, windows can be really tricky and you have to be super careful with windows. The problem with windows, especially during the daytime, and I run into this a lot in the corporate video work in offices, is that they can reflect a lot of stuff. So you don't want to see a big reflection of all of your equipment in the shot. And so you have to be careful about that. Make sure that the angle at which you're shooting makes it so that you're not getting a reflection of all the equipment in the windows. Now, another thing is at night, you will definitely have to be careful about where you put the lights in relation to windows because they will reflect on the windows as well. So that can make a big problem for you. Just something to watch out for. We do a lot of corporate interviews, and this is a kind of a pretty straightforward way to do that. And I just want to run through the lights here one by one. So I'm going to go ahead and run through and turn all of them off, and then we'll bring them back up one by one. And then we're going to turn off the key light. Oh, there's nothing. So first off, the key light. So what we're using here in this particular case is a Litepanels Gemini 1x1 soft through a softbox. It's a DOP choice. What's important here are a couple of things. Number one, that we have this in very close, as you can see on the behind the scenes camera. So this is less than a meter from our talent right here. We're using a softbox, so we make as large a light surface as possible to make it nice and soft. And the kind of characteristic of soft is that the larger the surface area that's emitting light is to your talent, the softer it will be and the more it will wrap around their face. So that's what you're seeing here is it's wrapping around. Another characteristic that we're doing here is that because she's doing an interview and looking off camera just a little bit here, not even 45 degrees, what we're doing as well is that we are lighting the far side of her face with that soft light source. And we're shooting at the fill side of her face. And that just adds a little bit more dimension and interest to the overall lighting design. So those are kind of the important characteristics, first of all, for a talking head / interview. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and turn on the hair light. We have a Litepanels Gemini 1x1 hard back here with a grid on it. And I'm going to pop that on here. Okay. We've done a couple things. You can also see that there's this flag here. This is just a flag that I've suspended up here with the C-stand. And what I'm doing is I'm preventing this light from going straight into the camera lens and creating too much blooming and flare. But at the same time, we're lighting the back of our talent's head so that we get a little separation and a little bit more dimension. You can see here that that light's coming in, hitting the back of her hair. It's very subtle, but it is enough to add just a little bit more dimension. All right, in this case, we're also lighting this little screen back here. And in that case, I'm just using two Astra 1x1s, a soft one and a hard one. You can see once those come up, that gives us some light on our backdrop there. Now, I did have to fill a little bit. We've got a little kind of credenza or shelf of some sort back there, and it kind of created these shapes, and I didn't really want those. So I've got a couple of RGB lights down here on the floor. And I'll just go ahead and pop those on as well. All right, and those just kind of fill in that a little bit more as well. So the overall lighting design here, so we're shooting at f2.8, which I wouldn't go any wider on the aperture than that because you're going to struggle with focus, especially if the talent moves much. But in this case here, we're measuring right at f2.8. We're at 23.976 frames per second, ISO 400, 180 degree shutter angle, and this light is only at 10%. So we have a lot of room there to punch that up if we needed to. Back here, I do a reading on these. These are just coming through at f1, basically. So we want to be careful and keep that lower. but just add an interesting dimension to our backdrop there. So hopefully that was helpful for you. I hope that gives you some ideas on how you can quickly do 3-point lighting, or in this case, technically we used 4 lights, but the 3 points of lighting are on me. Again, it's the key, the fill, and in this case, the rim. You could also do it as a hair light if you preferred, but then of course we added the 4th light back here on the background to add a little more interest. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. If you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.